Perhaps the most incredible story of the last million years is the rise of modern human culture. The cities we populate and the lives that we lead. It is the world that our children will inherit.
For most of history, the overwhelming majority of the Earth's inhabitants have owned, more or less, nothing. The clothes they stood up in, some bowls, a pot and a pan, perhaps a broom, and if things were going really well, a few farming implements. Nations and peoples remained consistently poor. Global GDP did not grow at all from year to year. The world was in aggregate as hard up in 1800 as it had been at the beginning of time. However, starting in the early 18th century, in the countries of northwestern Europe, a remarkable phenomenon occurred. Economies began to expand and wages to rise.
During the 17th century, new trade routes opened up, and a new middle class of traders and entrepreneurs emerged to exploit them. They'd reveled in their newfound wealth. It now became respectable to consume and to flaunt one's consumption. In 1776, one man would capture this spirit of self-interested individualism. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that the pursuit of luxury worked as an economic driver that would make everybody richer. The best way to encourage economic growth is to unleash individuals to pursue their own selfish economic interests, he wrote.
Families who'd never before had any money beyond what they needed just to survive found they could go shopping for small luxuries, a comb or a mirror, a spare set of underwear, a pillow, some thicker boots or a towel. Their expenditure created a virtuous economic cycle. The more they spent, the more businesses grew, the more wages rose. By the middle of the 18th century, observers recognized that they were living through a period of epochal change that historians have since described as the world's first consumer revolution. It was in Britain where the changes were most marked. Enormous new industries sprang up to cater for the widespread demand for goods that had once been the preserve of the very rich alone. The Christian church looked on and did not approve. Up and down England, clergymen delivered bitter sermons against the new materialism. They called it vanity, which was a sin. But there now emerged an intellectual revolution that sharply altered the understanding of the role of vanity in an economy. In 1723, a London physician called Bernard Mandeville published an economic tract titled The Fable of the Bees, which proposed that, contrary to centuries of religious and moral thinking, what made countries rich, and therefore safe, honest, generous-spirited and strong, was a very minor, unelevated and apparently undignified activity: shopping for pleasure. It was the consumption of what Mandeville called fripperies, hats, bonnets, gloves, butter dishes, soup tureens, shoehorns and hair clips, that provided the engine for national prosperity and allowed the government to do in practice what the church only knew how to sermonize about in theory: make a genuine difference to the lives of the weak and the poor. The only way to generate wealth, argued Mandeville, was to ensure high demand for absurd and unnecessary things. Of course, no one needed embroidered handbags, silk-lined slippers or ice creams, but it was a blessing that they could be prompted by fashion to want them, for on the back of demand for such trifles, workshops could be built, apprentices trained, and hospitals funded. Mandeville shocked his audience with the starkness of the choice he placed before them. A nation could either be very high-minded, spiritually elevated, intellectually refined, and dirt poor, or a slave to luxury and idle consumption, and very rich. The parameters of this debate have continued to dominate economic thinking ever since. We re-encounter them in ideological arguments between capitalists and communists and free marketeers and environmentalists.
During the 19th century, scarcity was gradually overcome. Personal wealth and the trade it promoted drove an unparalleled economic boom that transformed the West. Giant factories were built to provide the goods that society now demanded. And it wasn't just the production of goods which was revolutionized. The process of buying was itself transformed. After the first department store opened in 1852, shopping became a respectable leisure activity. Department stores offered a dream world of material luxury, promoting shopping as an experience to savor. And stores became the cathedrals for a new faith on the march.
In the 1920s, business leaders were faced with a dilemma. Overproduction of goods had exceeded demand. Production between 1860 and 1920 had increased by 12 to 14 times, while the population only increased by a factor of 3. There were several ways of solving the problem. One was to reduce working hours and raise wages so that production and consumption reached an equilibrium. This would have led to more leisure time for workers and a higher standard of living. The problem with this solution is that it could have entailed a slight decrease in profits. Corporations are mandated by law to maximize profits on behalf of their shareholders, regardless of social or environmental costs. According to business leaders, there was another problem. John Egerton, president of the National Association of Manufacturers, warned that a shorter work week would undermine the work ethic and potentially foment radicalism. If people had time to stop and think, they might also take the time to rethink their position in life. The emphasis should be put on work, Egerton stated. More work and better work, instead of upon leisure. It seems a harmless enough statement, but what businessmen were advocating was revolutionary. Production would no longer be about satisfying human needs. It would be an end in and of itself. Rather than a democracy of ideas, or a democracy of mass participation, the United States would become a democracy of material goods. The citizen would be replaced by the consumer.
By the early 20th century, Americans had the highest personal wealth of any country in the world, creating huge new markets. Enterprising business people realized that they could make their fortunes by manufacturing luxury items at prices the American working classes could afford. Henry Ford's assembly line made cars which were previously the preserve of just a privileged few available to all. Many other products were soon to follow. By the 1920s, the ordinary man and woman in America had come to believe that affluence was their birthright. And to have access to consumer wealth became an integral part of the American dream.
Shortly after World War II, these guys were figuring out how to ramp up the economy. Retailing analyst Victor Lebeau articulated the solution that's become the norm for the whole system. He said, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors chairman said that the American economy's ultimate purpose is to produce more consumer goods. More consumer goods? Our ultimate purpose? Not provide health care or education or safe transportation or sustainability or justice? Consumer goods? How did they get us to jump on board this program so enthusiastically? Well, two of their most effective strategies are planned obsolescence and perceived obsolescence. Planned obsolescence is another word for designed for the dump. It means they actually make stuff to be useless as quickly as possible, so we'll chuck it and buy a new one. There's also perceived obsolescence. Now, perceived obsolescence convinces us to throw away stuff that is still perfectly useful. Advertisements and media in general plays a big role in this.
Big business and its advertising agencies turned to the science of psychology. One of the pioneers was Edward Bernays, who would become known as the father of public relations. He was fascinated by the discoveries of Freud and other psychiatrists. He believed that if you understood what motivated people, you could influence their behavior without them knowing about it, and cajole them into buying even more.
Rather than focus on the intrinsic worth of a particular product, Bernays suggested a strategy where products became linked with the unconscious desires of the public. In this manner, there would be virtually no limits to either production or consumption.
One of his best-known efforts had to do with encouraging females, women, to smoke. He would stage beauty pageants, he would stage what would today be called photo ops and that sort of thing, in which smoking by women was portrayed as women's liberation, was portrayed as a way to be free and empowered.
In his book, The Status Seekers, Vance Packard uses the phrase merchants of discontent to describe a deliberate strategy by advertisers of targeting the less affluent with status symbol messages. For someone with little chance of changing their social conditions in life, consumerism offers a quick fix that allows people to feel as though they are climbing the social hierarchy, when in fact, they are standing still. The strategy was particularly evident in mid-century automobile advertising. Studies found the people who lived in housing developments were more likely to park their cars outside of the garage than those who could afford more expensive homes. A typical example is this advertisement from Plymouth. It reads, "We're not wealthy, we just look it." The American way of life would be characterized by a myth which would seem to make political activism unnecessary. In the new democracy of material goods, there were an infinite number of possessions to be purchased by rich and poor alike. There was no need to change institutions because the system was already perfect. It was called the American dream, and happiness was just one possession away.
Advertisers started to work out how to play on our subconscious. It wasn't what the product did that mattered, it was the kind of person it promised to make you feel. Consumerism was now deep inside our heads, exploiting our deepest feelings, our emotions, and even our identities. We were all being trained to desire.
Each of us in the US is targeted with over 3,000 advertisements a day. We see more advertisements in 1 year than people 50 years ago saw in a lifetime. And if you think about it, what's the point of an ad except to make us unhappy with what we have? So 3,000 times a day, we're told our hair is wrong, our skin is wrong, our clothes are wrong, our furniture is wrong, our car is wrong, we are wrong, but it can all be made right if we just go shopping. Media also helps by hiding all of this and all of this. So the only part of the materials economy we see is the shopping. The extraction, production, and disposal all happens outside of our field of vision.
All been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't.
Humans now own more than they have ever owned. Instead of buying what we need, consumerism has us wanting anything and everything we can get our hands on. The key to this is advertising.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Advertising creates a demand for products, and those products are sold for a profit. And that profit gives people more disposable income to spend.
Advertising is based on one thing: happiness.
Research shows that although we own more things now than we have in the past, people don't feel any happier than they previously have. This has been reflected in rising rates of depression and anxiety.
The things you own end up owning you.
And at the center of the cycle is capitalism. Some define capitalism as a political and economic system organized around making money.
Let me tell you something. There is no nobility in poverty. I have been a rich man and I have been a poor man, and I choose rich every fucking time.
So institutions and businesses are structured around the need to make money.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right.
Companies create a demand for products to increase profits and make money. Consumers buy those products, fueling a cycle of demand and profit.
But consumerism didn't always go unopposed. Most famously, in the 1960s, the hippie movement rebelled against rampant capitalism. It transformed this disgust with materialism not just into a philosophy, but into a new way of living too. Millions attempted to drop out. It was a movement that had enormous appeal. By the end of the 1970s, the environmentalist message was beginning to be taken seriously. Organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth captured the headlines. But then, America and the West took a fateful step. A new breed of politicians dismissed environmental warnings and ushered in an age of even more rampant materialism. Hippies were now replaced by yuppies, and a new philosophy ruled: greed is good. Throughout the 80s, we were all encouraged to measure our success by how much we earned and how much we bought. And today's successors to Thatcher and Reagan have done little to set aside the toxic legacy of such triumphalist individualism. Such is the momentum of consumerism that nothing has been able to slow its relentless march. After 9/11, with America shaken to its core, President Bush told the nation to demonstrate they were unbowed by this assault on the American way of life by going shopping.
We cannot let the terrorists achieve the objective of frightening our nation to the point where we don't conduct business, where people don't shop.
You can see what the president meant. Behaving normally was the best response. And normality in today's economy means being out there shopping.
Nothing, not even international terrorism, would be allowed to stand between the people and their pursuit of the great American dream.
The irony is that the biggest threat to the United States and to the rest of the world isn't terrorism. It's consumerism itself. We've unleashed so powerful a force that our politicians simply don't know how to get this particular genie back into its bottle.
So in the US, we have more stuff than ever before, but polls show that our national happiness is actually declining. We have more stuff, but we have less time for the things that really make us happy. Friends, family, leisure time. We're working harder than ever. Some analysts say we have less leisure time than any time since feudal society. And do you know what the two main activities are that we do with the scant leisure time we have? Watch TV and shop. In the US, we spend 3 to 4 times as many hours shopping as our counterparts in Europe do. So we're in this ridiculous situation where we go to work, maybe 2 jobs even, and we come home and we're exhausted, so we plop down on our new couch and watch TV, and the commercials tell us you suck, so you gotta go to the mall to buy something to feel better, and then you gotta go to work more to pay for the stuff you just bought, so you come home and you're more tired, so you sit down and you watch more TV, and it tells you to go to the mall again, and we're on this crazy work, watch, spend treadmill, and we could just stop.
We are consumers. We are byproducts of a lifestyle obsession. Murder, crime, poverty, these things don't concern me. What concerns me are celebrity magazines, television with 500 channels, some guy's name on my underwear.
But for most of us, the debate is no longer pertinent. We simply accept that we will live in consumer economies, with some very unfortunate side effects to them. Crass advertising, foodstuffs that are unhealthy for us, products that are disconnected from any reasonable assessment of our needs. All this in exchange for economic growth and high employment. We have chosen wealth over virtue. The one question that's rarely been asked is whether there might be a way to attenuate a dispiriting choice, to draw on the best aspects of consumerism on the one hand and high-mindedness on the other, without suffering their worst sides, moral decadence and profound poverty. Might it be possible for a society to develop that allows for consumer spending and therefore provides employment and welfare, yet of a kind directed at something other than vanities and superfluities? Might we shop for something other than nonsense? In other words, might we have wealth and a degree of virtue? It is this possibility of which we find some intriguing hints in the work of Adam Smith, too often read as a blunt apologist for all aspects of consumerism, but in fact one of its more subtle and visionary analysts. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Adam Smith seems at points willing to concede to key aspects of Mandeville's argument. Consumer societies do help the poor by providing employment based around satisfying what are often rather suboptimal purchases. Smith was as ready as other economists to mock the triviality of some consumer choices, while admiring their consequences. All those embroidered lace handkerchiefs, jewel snuff boxes, and miniature temples made of cream for dessert, they were flippant, he conceded, but they encouraged trade, created employment, and generated immense wealth, and could therefore be firmly defended on this score alone. However, Smith held out some fascinating hopes for the future. He pointed out that consumption didn't invariably have to involve the trading of frivolous things. He had seen the expansion of the Edinburgh book trade and knew how large a market higher education might become. He understood how much wealth was being accumulated through the construction of Edinburgh's extremely handsome and noble New Town. He understood that humans have many higher needs that require a lot of labour and intelligence and work to fulfil, but that lie outside of capitalist enterprise as conceived of by realists like Bernard Mandeville. Among these are need for education, for self-understanding, for beautiful cities, and for rewarding social lives. The ultimate goal of capitalism in Adam Smith's view was to tackle happiness in all its complexities, psychological and not just merely material. The capitalism of our times still hasn't entirely come round to resolving the awkward choices that Bernard Mandeville and Jean-Jacques Rousseau circled. But the crucial hope for the future is that we may not forever need to be making money off rather exploitative, silly, or vain consumer appetites, that we may also learn to generate enormous profits from helping people as consumers and producers in the truly important and ambitious aspects of their lives. The reform of capitalism hinges on an odd-sounding but critical task, a new kind of consumerism, the conception of an economy focused around buying and selling services and goods focused on our higher needs.
This biological compulsion to shop is partly due to the way humans are wired.
So there is an evolutionary aspect to this. The people that had the most stuff were most likely to survive. So you gather a lot of food for the winter, you gather a lot of wood for your shelter, and we still have that innate desire to kind of get enough stuff to make sure that we're going to survive.
Today, despite being surrounded by abundance, Americans are still collecting ever more stuff. In 2017, we spent $240 billion on goods like jewelry, watches, luggage, books, and phones, twice as much as in 2002, even though our population only grew by 13% during that time. Our spending on personal care items like lotions and makeup also doubled over that time.
So we're spending 20% more on clothes than we were in 2000. The average American buys 66 garments a year, which is insane. And we're even spending more on electronics, which is really interesting because electronics are actually cheaper than they used to be. So the dollar amount that we're spending is going up, even though the cost of things is going down.
And now that we do a lot of our shopping online, returning things has become more of a hassle. One survey found that 9 out of 10 shoppers said they never or rarely return online purchases.
And part of this is because things are so cheap. You think, is it really worth $5 of my time to print out the label and go to the post office and send it back when I'm really not going to get that much money back? Why not just keep this and maybe I'll use it eventually?
So where does all this stuff go? Well, a lot of it just becomes clutter in our ever-expanding homes. The average square footage of houses in the US rose by 23% in the last 2 decades, while the number of storage facilities doubled. It's become very easy to donate our unwanted goods to thrift stores, which makes us feel better about getting rid of our stuff. But it's estimated that most of the clothes we donate actually end up in landfills. The average American throws away an estimated 81 pounds of clothes and textiles each year, nearly 5 times more than in 1980. We collectively threw away 26 million tons of plastics in 2015, and only 9% got recycled. Consumers continue to want cheaper goods. This means that manufacturers have to cut costs and create lower quality products.
World population is expected to reach about 9 billion by 2050. The average rates at which we consume resources, such as oil and metals, and produce waste, like plastic and greenhouse gases, are about 32 times higher in North America, Western Europe, Japan and Australia than they are in the developing world. The poor of the world logically want to have our standards of living. But the fact is that the planet simply does not have sufficient resources to support such a dream.
In 20 years, the global middle class is expected to grow by 3 billion people. And we're on track to double the material resources we use by 2060.
We may see China's growing consumption as a problem, but the Chinese and many others are only reaching for the consumption rate we already have. Telling them they cannot or should not try would be hypocritical, immoral, self-serving, and futile, as it wouldn't work. What we should be trying to do is to make consumption rates and living standards more equal around the world, and to do it at a level the planet can sustain. The question is, how can we do this?
Coupling means using less resources for the same economic output, using them wisely, and breaking the link between economic growth, resource use, and environmental impacts. When the economy grows and resource use does not grow at the same rate, this is resource decoupling. When the economy grows and the environmental impact decreases, this is impact decoupling. Decoupling is an opportunity for innovation, efficient resource use, less waste, poverty reduction, job creation, and economic development.
In this model, manufacturers or retailers would remain the owners of the products. Maintenance and repairs becoming part of the deal. Even better if running costs, like electricity, were included. For companies, it makes sense to retain precious materials when their future availability is uncertain and when prices are forecast to rise. Premature obsolescence would be phased out, rather than designed in. Buying expensive goods up front would no longer be a necessity. It already happens with mobile phones and cars. Why not fridges, washing machines, power tools and so on? A system that works long-term by designing out waste and keeping valuable products in the loop, and maintaining or remanufacturing them, creating jobs in the process.
A sustainable economy is a dematerialized economy, where innovation is focused on delivering greater functionality with ever less material demand. One that can deliver more services with less stuff. One of the most environmentally destructive elements to the linear economic model has been its incentive structure that drives businesses to overproduce and people to overconsume in what has come to be called the consumer society. The industrial model was based on the mass production of tangible products that were pushed out to end users. Mass production meant that companies had to sell en masse, which gave rise to mass marketing and the creation of a consumer culture that went global with globalization. In this product-based transactional paradigm, there was a strong divide between the producer and consumer around the point of transactions due to the fact that both customer and producer had different incentives and motives that ran largely contrary to each other. Over the past couple of decades, with the rise of information technology, has come a new model to value delivery called the services economy. A services economy is one where the focus is on the service delivered, the actual outcomes of a process. It is based on the system's delivered functionality instead of the amount of resources consumed in the production of the product. By shifting the producer's revenue stream away from the production of products and focusing it on the delivery of functionality, servicization is a powerful approach for breaking the core dynamic driving the consumerist economic model. With servicization, ownership of the product stays with the producer, and its maintenance likewise remains their responsibility. In such a way, they are incentivized to produce less while delivering more functionality. The end result is an alignment of the interests of the end user with producer and sustainable outcomes for the overall system. Services are really about access. The idea that people want access to services instead of simply the ownership of products. This is why the services economy goes hand in hand with networked information technology. Information technology and online platforms enable us to easily and cheaply coordinate the exchange and temporary usage of resources, thus working to make access easier and cheaper than ownership. In this way, extra capacity can be created through more effective organization instead of actually producing more products. A sustainable economy would be one that is able to focus its innovation and resources not on producing more products, but on delivering greater functionality through the intelligent coordination of existing resources. Traditional thinking, institutions, and management methods that created the sustainability crisis will not solve it. As such, the development of truly sustainable global economy would involve a transformation in the deep structure of post-industrial economies.
Changing the goal of the entire economy is a huge task. Of course, we can't do it all at once. But when we focus on game-changing solutions, we gradually make it possible for a new game to be played. To do that, we have to be able to tell the difference between a game-changing solution or just a new way to play that old game of more. Whenever I'm asked to join in on a solution, I want to know if it's transformational. Will it change the goal? To figure it out, I use the word goal. I want to know that it, G, gives people more power, taking power back from corporations to build democracy. O opens people's eyes to the truth that once basic needs are met, happiness and well-being don't come from buying more stuff, but from our communities, our health, and a sense of purpose. A accounts for all the costs it creates, including the toll it takes on people and the planet. In other words, it internalizes costs instead of externalizing them, as most businesses do today. L lessens the enormous wealth gap between those who can't even meet their basic needs and those who consume way more than their fair share. When I see a solution that does all that, or can be redesigned to, I'm in. And how about the new trend of collaborative consumption, formerly known as sharing? Sharing may sound like the theme of a Barney song, but think about it. It's a huge challenge to the old game. It gets us off the treadmill of more, conserves resources, gives people access to stuff they otherwise couldn't afford, and builds community. What's it look like? Bike share programs in major cities. Online platforms that let us share everything from our cars to our homes to camping gear. In my town, the public library system lends out tools. There's just no reason that every house needs its own power drill, creme brulee torch, scanner, wheelbarrow, bike pump when we can share. As transformational solutions like these gain traction, we will reach a tipping point if we keep focused on the new goal of better. Now it's time to build the solutions. Solutions that won't just change a few of the rules, but will change the entire game. Want to help? Come on, let's do it.